All right, welcome to Standing for Truth, and specifically welcome to this next video, Answering the Critics. And so the question is, which critic are we answering and refuting in this video? The answer is our good friend SciManDan. And I am excited to get into this, as the video that he has put out against us, responding to one of our videos, has to do with the scientific evidence for Adam and Eve and separate ancestry in general. As anybody knows who follows this channel and follows our work, the topic of Adam and Eve and separate ancestry is a major study of mine. And so I am excited to respond to SciManDan's arguments here. And therefore, we are just going to get right into it. I am going to share screen and quickly set the foundation before I get into his video. I have responded to nearly all of the most militant critics of young Earth creation. And so the last video I put out was a video response to arguments advanced by Gutsick Gibbon, specifically homology and nested hierarchies. And so if you check out that video right here, homology and nested hierarchies, responding to Gutsick Gibbon, scroll down to the comment section and you can find a comprehensive list of many of the response videos we have done here on Standing for Truth. And so I specifically late last year, I did a two-part series responding to Aaron Ra on separate ancestry. He's completely dodged those videos. He has essentially dodged those arguments. And so check out those, part 1 and part 2. Part 2 was very thorough in terms of covering the amazing evidence for Eve. I went over the Eve consensus sequence. I've obliterated arguments from Pelagia, the so-called best evidence for evolution, and Pelagia has essentially dodged those arguments as well. And so you can find a list of many of these videos that comprise responses to our favorite critics of young Earth creation here. And so this is the video by SciManDan that we are going to be responding to. I just watched a few minutes of it just before recording this video. And it's not going to be incredibly difficult to respond to. And I watched this when it first came out 3 months ago, and I remember thinking the same thing. I did not feel rushed to respond because most of the impromptu debates that we do in the debate dojo, we do frequent open mics here. The open mics go between 4 and 6 hours, and we get some very technically minded evolutionists in the debate dojo for impromptu discussion on all things origins, but specifically the topic of separate ancestry. And so this is going to be more or less an easy response, but it is going to be a fun one nonetheless. And especially considering how popular SciManDan is, I think it's important that he receives a rebuttal or counter to his points here. And so let's get right into it. I am going to mute in order that there is no echo in terms of playing his video. And here we go, guys.
Right, back to today's video, which unbelievably has Standing for Truth supplying us with evidence for the existence of Adam and Eve. Oh, I can't wait for this one. Take it away, matey.
And one observation that I find most evolutionists don't want to discuss when they're talking about this DNA similarity is specifically the Y chromosome, which is uniparentally inherited DNA, right? We get that from our fathers.
If you want to be technical, you get an X chromosome from your father too, if you're a girl. But yes, you can only get a Y chromosome from the paternal side.
Well, it turns out when they sequenced the chimpanzee Y chromosome. Okay, I'll respond real quick. Nothing significant there. But yes, Y chromosome is uniparentally inherited DNA. Of course, we also get an X chromosome. Women get 2 X chromosomes. And amazingly, the long non-coding RNA that was discovered in the non-coding regions of the genome, parts of the genome that the evolutionary community once assumed were junk or the result of evolutionary leftovers, there's a long non-coding RNA gene that actually functions in X chromosome deactivation in women, because they don't get a Y chromosome, they get 2 X chromosomes, and men get XY. Okay, but a double dosage of the X chromosome is bad. It's harmful. It's not good. And so a part of the genome, again, specifically a long non-coding RNA gene found in what evolutionists assumed was non-functional junk, that participates, or that is active in X chromosome deactivation. So Y chromosome is uniparentally inherited DNA. Specifically, it is paternally inherited. So it's inherited on the father's side. I got my Y chromosome from my dad. He got his Y chromosome from his dad. Maternally inherited DNA is the mitochondrial DNA. So that is also uniparentally inherited DNA, but that is passed down on the mother's side. And so I like to point out that we've literally discovered Adam and Eve, our first parents, the first couple, directly in the genetics or the genomes of human beings, because there's one female ancestor that we've discovered in mitochondrial DNA of all people on the globe today. And there's one Y chromosomal ancestor. Every single male Y chromosome on the planet is nearly identical and can be traced back to a single Y chromosomal ancestor in the not so distant past, roughly 4,500 years ago, in light of the fast mutation rate in the Y chromosome. Mitochondrial DNA, it's the same thing. Very low variation, fast mutation rate in the mitochondrial DNA. Only about 6,000 years worth of mutations have accumulated in the mitochondrial DNA. Now, why the uniparentally inherited DNA compartments? Why are they the best way to answer the question of ancestry? It's because they are less messy. Okay, they lack, for the most part, recombination, as there is no counterpart like we see in autosomal nuclear DNA, where you have the chromosomes line up and they exchange genetic content or material. Essentially, they're scrambled, they're shuffled every single generation. And that is what helps in producing novel chromosomal combinations. Okay, you get 50% of your DNA from mom, 50% of your DNA from dad. And the uniparentally inherited DNA, like the Y chromosome and the mitochondrial DNA, again, for the most part, they lack recombination. It's less messy. They should be more stable. The mitochondrial DNA is only about 16,500 letters long. The Y chromosome is a lot more than that, but still nothing compared to your autosomal nuclear DNA, which is 3 billion letters. 3 billion from mom, 3 billion from dad, and so 6 billion altogether. Okay. And so we're essentially able to track back using mitochondrial DNA. We can track back all of these branches, right? Every time a mutation is added to a mitochondrial DNA phylogenetic tree, that's another branch that's added. And so you can trace those branches back to a single female ancestor that we've all descended from in the not so distant past. And so let's continue his video here. And here we go. It's only about, when you consider overall architecture, gene content, and size differences, Jay, it's only about 35% the same. So that is a ton of genetic differences and just massive chromosomal rearrangements to account for in just 6 million years.
In the paper, Dynamic Evolution of Great Ape Y Chromosomes, the author states, the Y chromosomes of great apes represent a particular puzzle. Their gene content is more similar between human and gorilla than between human and chimpanzee, even though human and chimpanzee share a more recent common ancestor. To solve this puzzle here, we constructed a dataset including Ys from all extant great ape genera. We generated assemblies of bonobo and orangutan Ys from short and long sequencing reads and aligned them with the publicly available human, chimpanzee, and gorilla Y assemblies. Analysing this dataset, we found that the genus Pan, which includes chimpanzee and bonobo, experienced accelerated substitution rates. Pan also exhibited elevated gene death rates. This means that we know why that is the case. And for some reason, you failed to mention the high similarities between the Y chromosomes of humans and gorillas. I wonder why.
Yeah, and the whole thing that relates.
Okay, let me pause it there, but I also want to make sure that the audio was shared there. Yeah, it should have been. So I find it interesting that SciManDan makes the argument or points that he did, because it's clear that he doesn't realize what the major issue is when it comes to Y chromosomal DNA here. And I've presented on this numerous times. The separate ancestry model would argue that humans are created separate and independent from any other form of life on the planet. Okay. And so we should be able to make very specific predictions, especially using genetics. Genetics is a great way to determine ancestry because it is genes, it's traits, it's genetics that are passed down sperm and egg, right? A rock isn't, geology isn't, geography isn't, but genes and traits. And so what's interesting is, according to the evolutionary model, humans and chimpanzees share a most recent common ancestor, as in the chimpanzees are our closest biological cousin and can, according to the evolutionary story, be traced back to a common ancestor roughly 6 million years ago. Okay. And the gorilla is a more distantly related relative. But yet it turns out that the human Y chromosome and the gorilla Y chromosome are more similar to each other than either are to the chimpanzee Y chromosome. That is a break in the so-called nested hierarchy that the evolutionary community points to as evidence for common descent. As you can see here on the diagram of Y chromosomes, grade 8 Y chromosomes, because they would consider human a human grade ape, and then they would consider chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, orangutans non-human grade apes. Okay. And so the chimpanzee, you'll notice right off the bat, it's half the size. Did SciManDan provide a rebuttal to any of this? No. He just read from the excerpt of this paper, but he didn't provide any actual arguments or rebuttals to this. This is also why I like to say it's the differences that make all the differences. Because the evolutionary community, they love to point out the similarities. They love to focus on the agnostic lines of evidence when it comes to the origins debate. But I point out there's a lot of overlap between the creation and evolutionary models. And homology, for the most part, is one of them. The evolutionists would argue similarity by common ancestry or through common descent. And the creationists would argue these common features, these similarities, shared similarities, as being the result of common design. And so it's more so agnostic to the debate. Human engineers build in homologous patterns, and so why shouldn't God? I don't want to focus too much on that because that was my last video response to Erica, and that was about an hour long. I specifically focused on homology and nested hierarchies. Now, the differences make all the difference because we need to focus on differentiating lines of evidence. A line of evidence that one of the two models can explain. in that one of the two models can explain and only explain. And so again, chimpanzee Y chromosomes are half the size. You can notice this here. The gene content totally different. The architecture different. And so when you consider overall gene content, architecture, and size differences, it turns out that the chimpanzee Y chromosome and the human Y chromosome are only about 35% the same. I mean, right off the bat, you're starting at 50%. And SciManDan completely dodged this. Anybody who follows this channel, anybody who's watched my debates, anybody who's watched my full presentations and lectures on this topic knows that I always focus on the gorilla Y chromosome. The video Dan is responding to is just a 5-minute clip from a larger video, okay, that I did. And not as much information would be provided there, okay, as another presentation. Talking about the gorilla Y chromosome doesn't help SciManDan because it shows a break in the nested hierarchy, since the human Y and the gorilla Y, apparently they're more like each other than either are to the chimpanzee, but the chimpanzee is supposed to be our closest cousin. So my challenge to SciManDan, and he won't be able to answer this, he probably won't even try to answer it. How do you explain such massive differences in the chimpanzee Y chromosome? Again, just look at the heterochromatin right here. This heterochromatin, it's functional DNA. It is densely packed pieces of DNA that primarily compose repetitive sequences like satellite DNA, okay? Well, it's largely absent in the chimpanzee Y chromosome. The chimpanzee Y chromosome and human Y chromosomes in terms of gene content, vastly different. Entire gene families missing. And the architecture is different, as I pointed out. And so my challenge is, how do you explain such dramatically different chromosomes? Because if the humans and chimpanzees split from a common ancestor here, let's say 6 million years ago, human lineage goes one way, chimpanzee and bonobo lineage goes another. Okay. Well, within that time frame, apparently the chimpanzee Y chromosome would have had to change this dramatically in that time. And all we have so far are untested hypotheses from the evolutionary community. No, this is exactly what the separate ancestry model, this is exactly what a biblical creationist would expect and predict if separate ancestry is true. The Bible claims to be the history book of the universe. The account of human origins in Genesis claims that God specially created Adam and Eve, two first human beings. Adam, the first man, Eve, the mother of all living. And they were created separate and independent from any other form of life. That includes chimpanzees, that includes gorillas, that includes orangutans, and that includes strawberries. And throw banana plants in there, okay? Separate ancestry. And yet this is exactly what we find. This is confirmation of the separate ancestry model, as based on Y chromosomes alone, we have the humankind that is separate from the chimpanzee and bonobo kind. Chimpanzee and bonobos go back to a common archetype 4,500 years ago. You have a gorilla kind that goes back to its own archetype. And then you got the orangutans, and their Y chromosomes are fairly similar as well. But it is the chimpanzee that is the odd man out, and I see no response. I see no sophisticated response from SciManDan here. As a matter of fact, he just waves it away. Hand waves it away. Doesn't acknowledge it, doesn't even attempt to engage this data. And so here's from the 2020 paper on the great ape Y chromosomes. I've discussed this in great detail. Notice what they say. They're shocked by this. They point out, despite a recent divergence of these species, but notice, they'll never question the evolutionary story, right? If they question the story, they can question details within the story, but if they question the story itself, their work, their paper is not going to be published. That is a fact. And one thing evolutionists fail to acknowledge or understand, and I see this every time I debate them for the most part, is they don't know how to differentiate between the data and what the authors believe about the data, or what the conclusions, a lot of the times untested conclusions of the data is. No, we care about the data. We care about the evidence. The interpretation is up for debate. And the interpretation or the conclusions found within these technical papers made by the authors that are evolutionists, they believe in evolution, they believe in common descent. That's their starting point. That's their mindset. That's their worldview. Those interpretations are up for debate. But the data will oftentimes say one thing, and then their conclusion is saying something separate from what the data clearly indicates or points to. Okay, so the data is what? Chimpanzee Y is only half the size of the human Y. We see that here. Their Y chromosomes differ enormously in size and gene content. Just what I was saying. You can see that just by looking at the diagram. It's color-coded. You got the heterochromin. You got the U chromatin. Okay, you can look to further details within the paper about other specific types of genes and gene content that's totally different between the two kinds. And so notice what they say here. The percentage of gene families shared by these two chromosomes that split about 6 million years ago, right? So they're assuming there was a split. They're not questioning the split. I would argue that this data suggests that there wasn't a split, because how can you account for such massive differences in just 6 million years, supposedly, since the split? So they say that it is similar to that shared by human and chicken autosomes, autosomal nuclear DNA. That's biparentally inherited DNA. That split over 310 million years ago. And they notice, puzzlingly, this is a puzzle to them. There's no good answer yet. They'll say, well, sperm competition, maybe faster rates of gene conversion, maybe faster mutation rates. Okay, thanks for the guesses. Thanks for the stories. Thanks for the rescue mechanisms. But it is pseudoscience until you test it. I want to see a sophisticated mathematical model that shows us how in 6 million years you can get entire rearrangements of significant chromosomal parts, how the gene content can change so dramatically. I want to see when, where, how you get the evolution of entirely new gene families. How do you lose half the chromosome? I don't want stories. I don't want maybe this, maybe that, maybe this. I want to see empirical data that supports these hypotheses. If they're untested and there's no support for the evidence, or they're not backing up the observation of, let's say, sperm competition in chimpanzees, then it's not science, it's pseudoscience. Now, they can believe that humans and chimpanzees are related through common ancestry, but that's not science, because the scientific data suggests otherwise, whether they want to admit it or not. And so they say, in terms of shared genes and overall architecture, the human Y is more similar to the gorilla Y than to the chimpanzee Y. And SciManDan, this went right over his head. The fact that this is an inconsistency in the nested hierarchy that the evolutionary community and defenders or guardians of fish to fisherman evolution point to as evidence for their model of origins. No, this is a puzzle to the evolutionary community. This was not predicted. This is confusing. What is the answer? That's what I want to see from Dan. Notice this from the 2010 paper titled Chimpanzee and Human Y Chromosomes Are Remarkably Divergent. They've known about this for a while. 2010, we were looking at a 2020 paper, and they still have only untested hypotheses. The chimpanzee MSY harbors twice, notice this, twice as many massive palindromes as the human MSY. So it's not just some, no, it's twice the amount. Yet it has lost large fractions. Notice how they're arguing that it was lost. Oh, really? Where's the evidence that it was lost? Maybe it was never there because they were never related. Yet it has lost large fractions of the MSY protein coding genes and gene families present in the last common ancestor. How do they know that those were present in the last common ancestor? I want to see what that last common ancestor is. Show me what that last common ancestor is. Present it to me and show me its genome. See, so many evolutionists, they're not critical thinkers. They're not looking at this objectively. They're going into the reading of these papers in the same way that the authors are going into the writing of these papers, assuming that common ancestry is true. They're not willing to question common ancestry. That's why their interpretations are easily debunked in light of what the data is clearly saying. And so evolutionists, apologists of evolution, when they say, oh, you can't use these papers to argue for separate ancestry because the authors believe in evolution. The authors disagree with you. The authors reject young earth creation and separate ancestry. And so you can't use the data from these papers. As a matter of fact, you can't use these papers at all. That shows their incredible bias. They're not willing to look at the data objectively. They're not willing to go to the conclusion that the data clearly takes them. They want to blindly believe what the authors of these papers are concluding, even though those conclusions are largely untested and unsupported. Surprisingly, however, more than 30% of chimpanzee MSY sequence has no homologous alignable counterpart in the human MSY, and vice versa. This is a gift to creation science, and another gift to creation science, and a gift to me, is SciManDan's video here, and the last video he did a while ago, because it shows how bankrupt the common descent model is. It shows how deeply they are lacking in a sophisticated answer or response to this data and this challenge. And I want to see SciManDan put in the work. I want to see him give a presentation, a lecture, a video longer than 11 minutes that actually addresses this major challenge to common descent. And so here's a review article, a commentary article of that 2020 paper. And notice, they admit that this hypothesis, one of them, sperm competition, right? They have to argue that there were accelerated changes in the chimpanzee line and the bonobo line to hold on to common descent and to still say that humans and chimpanzees are related. They have to argue for accelerated changes. But these are sizable differences. And there is yet to be presented a mathematical model that is both technical, it's detailed, it's comprehensive, that answers these questions. That shows us here's when the changes happened, here's how the changes happened, and give us a detailed model laying out all of the changes, the accelerated changes that took place in 6 million years. Notice how they say, we think that this might have happened or this happened, and they think it's consistent with the data. They think it's consistent, but notice they admit it needs to be evaluated in subsequent studies. And so I don't care who the evolutionist is. I don't care how popular the evolutionist is on YouTube. If they say that this challenge has been solved, then I want to see their paper. I want to see where they actually backed up these hypotheses, because they've yet to be tested, and they need to be tested, because at this point it's pseudoscience, and it's not looking good at all for the evolutionists. And so I want the audience to see clearly how funny that portion was. I could go on and on and on that specific portion, but that is a differentiating line of evidence in terms of answering this question of ancestry, universal ancestry, which says all life, including strawberries and whales, are related, and separate ancestry, which says humans are created separate. They exist separately from any other form of life, including mosquitoes, including whales, including chimpanzees. See, I don't mind staying as close to home as possible. I don't need to go as far out in evolutionary history as, the origin of eukaryotes. We'll stay as close to home as possible. Are humans and chimpanzees related? And this is just one of the many lines of evidence that suggests they're not. Even in the similar regions, genomic regions of human and chimpanzee DNA, there are differences in the way those genes are expressed or the way those genes are regulated. Gene expression is the process by which a gene is turned on to produce a functional RNA or protein. And the way that occurs in these similar regions between humans and chimpanzees is, guess what? It's different. There's differences in alternative splicing. There's differences in epigenetics. This amazingly complicated extra layer of genetic information that is above and beyond the genetic code, the DNA code. And there's differences in epigenetics between humans and chimpanzees. There's differences in the 3D architecture of the human and chimpanzee genome. But the Y chromosome dissimilarity is an absolute fatal blow to the evolutionary model. And I highly encourage creationists to utilize this data, because even your most popular, even your most well-educated evolutionists lack an answer. Because even in the conventional literature, they're admitting that they have hypotheses that are untested. And so let's continue with the video here, guys.
Relates to secular scientists making the claim that they believe that we all on the entire planet, we have all come from one male and one female. Now, before you think that sounds like the Bible, they're quick to say, no, this isn't the biblical Adam and Eve. Don't get excited. Yes, but there was one male and one female, but there were other people living at the time, but their genetics didn't get passed on, just the one male and one female. And they initially said this male and female didn't even live together at the same time, which sounds kind of funny, but it could work out genetically. Theoretically, you'll skip that. But as they studied it further, the breaking news is, surprise, Y chromosome Adam and mitochondrial Eve actually apparently lived together at the same time, because they're looking at more realistic mutational rates and all that. And they know we came from one male by studying that Y chromosome. They can tell we all share that one Y chromosome.
The issue here, of course, is that sex determination still happened before the Y chromosome evolved. So your Adam, as you put it, is irrelevant anyway.
And then the female side, there's some DNA in the mitochondria of the cell, which is the powerhouse of the cell, and only females.
So right there was a claim, evolutionary philosophy. Okay, shows no evidence of this fanciful story that evolutionists would believe in terms of the origin of Y chromosome or even mitochondrial DNA. No, the evidence suggests that we have one male ancestor, one Y chromosomal ancestor that goes back just 4,500 years ago, and one female ancestor that goes back just thousands of years ago, based on DNA variation, based on phylogenetics, and based on the mutation rate.
Pass that on. So by studying Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA, they've determined one male and one female, and now they realize that they did live together at the same time. And when you take into account real mutational rates, not theoretical, you go back about 6,000 years. They also believe that in our not too distant past, almost everyone became extinct, and only a small group survived to repopulate the planet.
They are insinuating the Great Flood here, of course, but to believe that would mean believing mass incest. But besides that, again, male and females were being decided before these two individuals. And some species as well actually use temperature now in today's day and age to decide whether or not a baby is going to be male or female. Plus, the Y chromosome evolved around 300,000 years ago, which is way, 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 way older than 6,000 years.
Now, before you say, well, that sounds like the flood, they don't get it.
Okay, so let's deal with some of those issues. Mass incest. See, when it comes to inbreeding, and I've pointed this out many, many times, inbreeding reveals the hidden reservoir of genetic mistakes. There has to be genetic mistakes in order for there to be an inbreeding problem. Okay. Adam and Eve would have been created with no mutations. You have three bottlenecks in the creation model. You have the creation bottleneck, Adam and Eve, and they would have been created with created differences. This is created heterozygosity. They would have been created in a state of DNA diversity. The vast majority of genetic variation that we see is created. It's beneficial, it's functional, it's designed, it's good. Mutations typically provide negative diversity, akin to the dents, the rust molecules, the bumps, the dings on your car, because mutations are overwhelmingly deleterious. Okay, so there'd be no mutations. I'd love to see for once if someone like SciManDan could steel man the creation model, because it's nothing but a straw man argument. The first bottleneck, Adam and Eve, they start having kids, and then their kids have kids, and then their kids' kids have kids. And so we have rapid and exponential population growth with little to no mutations after the fall being generated and passed on to progeny. So this is a one generation bottleneck, no significant inbreeding effects. Of course, Adam and Eve's kids, they're going to have to marry family members. They're going to have to marry cousins only for a few generations because there's nobody else on the planet. Okay. And so then you have the flood bottleneck. That's the second bottleneck. 8 people, Noah, his wife, their 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their 3 wives. But that again is a single generation bottleneck. It's not a long-term bottleneck because those 3 reproducing couples, Shem, Ham, Japheth, and their wives, they start having kids, and then more kids are produced, and so on and so forth. So it's rapid and exponential population growth. Then at the Tower of Babel, you have another kind of bottleneck before people are spread out into all parts of the globe and they seize dominion over the planet, I guess you could say. These are short-lived bottlenecks. Mutations do not become as incredibly harmful as we see them today until sometime after the flood. Yeah, mutations, a little bit of them were introduced in the pre-flood world, and then they were more were generated in the post-flood world. But again, we have rapid and exponential population growth. It is the evolutionists that have the inbreeding problem, because the evolutionist explains the vast majority, if not all, DNA differences in genetic variation as being the result of deleterious mutation accumulation over time. Notice this. I thought I had the slides for it, but that's fine. This just talks about how humans have very low genetic diversity, which is what we'd expect as biblical creationists, and the Y chromosomes have very low genetic variation. Okay, and so the evolutionary model, they have a bottleneck in Africa. This is not a 1-generation bottleneck. This is not a 2-generation bottleneck. This is an extended bottleneck, a bottleneck that lasts thousands of years. They explain all genetic variation for the most part as being the result of mutations over time, deleterious mutation accumulation. And so during their bottleneck in Africa, the out of Africa population bottleneck, you have all these mutations that are in recessive form. They're coming to the forefront, and they're leading to rapid and accelerated genetic degeneration. They're leading to all kinds of disease and genetic decline, which would manifest in the phenotype. It would manifest outwardly in morphology. And this is an incredibly degenerative and disease-causing process. And yet we're supposed to believe that from this nearly extinct population of somewhere between 2 and 10,000, some say 30,000, these nearly extinct people left Africa, spread out in all parts of the planet, and seized dominion over the globe, and eventually invented cars and skyscrapers and laptops so we can stream and produce these videos, and the space shuttle. No, I don't think so. They're the ones with the inbreeding problem. And that is still a challenge or a problem that I have not seen people like SciManDan address. So here's the mitochondrial DNA. This is a phylogenetic tree. You can see it's an unrooted tree, gives us a most natural reading of the data. And you can get this from the Thousands Genomes program. That is the data. Okay, these are people groups, African people groups, European people groups. This is the most common haplogroup in Europe, from my understanding, HVR. Okay, and these branches all go back to a center point. And we would argue this is evidence of one woman because there's low variation. On average, there's only about 25 DNA differences separating any 2 people in the mitochondrial DNA. The max is about 140. And you'll notice these branches that represent mutations or DNA differences, they're differing in size. This tells us that mutation rates are variable. They're not necessarily constant. The same people can pick up more mutations in the same amount of time than their cousins, because these all go back to a common ancestor. And so now SciManDan can't really look to the evolutionary molecular clock, as there's too many assumptions there that aren't validated by the empirical data or the evidence itself. And so no, mitochondrial DNA or Y chromosome, because it's the same thing. Low variation, fast mutation rate in the Y chromosome. It's about 1 to 3 per generation. We have evidence for one man one Y chromosomal ancestor, who's Noah, Y chromosome Noah. It doesn't go back. There's not enough DNA variation in the Y chromosome to go back 300,000 years, like he said. He's making claims, he's making assertions. These would not stand, these would not last in the debate dojo or the debate octagon. He's just claiming. This is all evolutionary philosophy. This is all evolutionary storytelling. Notice, because the phylogenetic rate, which the evolutionists look to, that is based on very many assumptions. One of them is the geologic column and common descent or common ancestry. And so they assume evolution to prove evolution, and then they calibrate the data. And so rather than looking at the per generation rate, which you can do the genealogical rate, where you take, let's say in the Y chromosome, you have grandfathers, fathers, and sons. Count up the differences and you get a fast mutation rate. In the mitochondrial DNA, you can do these pedigree studies. You can take grandmothers, mothers, daughters. Count out the DNA differences between the three. And again, you'll get a fast mutation. In the mitochondrial DNA, it's about 0.1 to 0.5. Very fast, but low variation. And so, no, you don't get Y chromosome and the mitochondrial DNA going back 200,000 to 300,000 years. I challenge SciManDan to demonstrate that empirically. I want to see science that is testable, that is demonstrable, that is falsifiable. I want to see him make future testable predictions on this DNA data, which he can't do, and I predict he won't do. Notice from this paper in 2022, the observed mutation rate, right, pedigree analysis, the empirical rate, is approximately 10-fold higher. It's 10 times higher than phylogenetically, which assumes evolution, derived rates. 10 times. Think about that for a minute. We also know hypermutation is a reality. Notice this, in real time, 2 families had genetic drivers of germline hypermutation, where mutations can accumulate more than the norm. Hypermutation. Environment can influence mutation rates as well. Look at this paper. Environmental exposures in parents, such as ionizing radiation, can influence the number of mutations transmitted to offspring. Okay. So you can't assume a constant rate. You can't look to African genetic variation and say, well, they must be an older population. They have more genetic variation or more DNA differences, or the nesting in terms of phylogenetics is different. No. After the flood, you'd have rocks because of all the heat, the energy, the radiation produced at the flood. You'd have rocks and you'd have caves that would be high in radiation and environmental poisons in many ways that could speed up the mutation rate for a few hundred years or more. And so a long line on a phylogenetic tree may actually represent just 1 or 2 generations of hypermutation. And so there's a lot of assumptions that go, unfortunately, into these arguments. Notice this. We also found the overall point mutation rate is significantly higher in Africans than in Europeans. We also know recombination rates are higher in some African people groups, and so they can harbor more genetic diversity. Recombination is generally driven by this interesting DNA element, this gene called PRDM9, okay, that helps with recombination. They have more of these PRDM9 hotspots. There's at least one significant paper on that issue. And this gene can basically latch on to a very specific position in the chromosome and then generate recombination. And I find it interesting because, so if you go to this mitochondrial DNA tree here, you'll notice that your longest branch is the African branch. And so the evolutionary community, or well-informed evolutionists like Dr. Dan Stern-Cardinal, for example, they'll argue that separate ancestry or biblical creation can't be true because Africa has the most genetic diversity. And then they'll argue that everything outside of Africa basically nests within Africa. And so Africans must be older than non-Africans, which to them refutes the out of Babel model or out of Middle East model, because they got to look to the out of Africa model, and they got to take the out of Africa event back roughly 100 to 200,000 years ago. Okay. Firstly, they don't realize that everything is going to nest within the epicenter from which we all originated or dispersed from. And so the epicenter of genetic diversity is right around what? The Middle East and Africa. So of course, everything's going to nest within that area. But the problem is wherever we place the epicenter of genetic variation, it's based on several assumptions, many of them unknowable. So yeah, they want to place it right in Africa, and so everything nests within there. That's just a side effect of them placing the epicenter there. That's a side effect. Put it in the Middle East, just a little bit over, and everything's going to nest in the Middle East. And so as creationists, we have many technical papers that support what I'm about to say, which is faster mutation rates in African lineages. Dr. Nathaniel Jensen, he made a future testable prediction that only future research can confirm either to be true or not in Khoisan peoples. And they have a lot of genetic diversity, and he predicted that their mutation rate is higher. And so once we test their mutation rate, we'll see if that prediction is true or not. And so all you need is mutation rates higher in Africans. We've already shown at least one paper here that there's specific regions within African genomes that mutate faster than in Europeans. That was the HBB region. We also know that recombination is faster. There's more recombination. There's more PRDM9 hotspots in African peoples. We know PRDM9 genes can be broken down or degenerated due to mutations over time. Okay, so there could have been more of those in the past. We also know that selective sweeps, they exist, they're real. And so let's say in the past you had a selective sweep across Eurasia, Europe and Asia, that resulted in older lineages basically being completely wiped out. Okay, so they're wiped out. And then the ones in Africa, they remain and they survive. And so the artifact of that is these lineages with more genetic diversity. So say you have lineages in Eurasia that have equal or more genetic variation than in Africa, but a selective sweep results in those lineages being wiped out. But now you have the African lineages remaining. So the evolutionists look to those and say, well, because of the levels of genetic diversity or variation in the African genomes here, they must be an older population. When in fact, no, this is just a side effect or the result of other lineages in Eurasia being wiped out. Okay, so that's one possibility. And so again, you're going to get the same nesting pattern. The nesting pattern is agnostic because it's just going to result, that nesting pattern is the ripple effect of where you place the epicenter of genetic diversity. Africa could have started with higher initial population sizes after the Tower of Babel dispersal, where basically you have many people groups, many individuals moving into Africa out of Babel, right? Just waves and waves of people moving into Africa as compared to outside of Africa, Eurasia, Europe, and Asia. And many of Noah's descendants, they could have moved into Africa. More people means more diversity. That is in Africa, plus environmental conditions. They're closer to the equator. A lot of them exist in tribes, and so they're accumulating their own independent mutations, which means all the tribes are independently drifting from each other genetically, which would create a lot of interesting observations in Africa in terms of genetic variation. And so that's really all you need to explain the nesting. And every single one of those factors that I just pointed out are actually supported by what? Many technical papers. Okay. So this goes to say that just because Africa has more genetic diversity does not mean that they're older. And the variation, the mutation rate in Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA does not suggest at all that they go back 200 to 300,000 years. Not at all. And so these are just claims. These are assertions that are not being backed up in SciManDan's video here. He's not doing very good. He's not doing his due diligence in backing up his claims here. He's not really refuting anything. And the Y chromosome dissimilarity point of humans and chimpanzees, the fact that humans and chimpanzees are only about 35% the same in Y chromosome when you consider overall gene content, overall architecture, and overall size differences. He didn't address any of that. He didn't provide any sophisticated response or mathematical model demonstrating how that's even possible. He missed the point that the gorilla Y and the human Y being more similar to each other than either are to the chimpanzee Y is actually a break or an inconsistency in his evolutionary nested hierarchy. And so all of this actually works against SciManDan. And as I pointed out earlier, SciManDan's video here, it is a great gift to me, to you, and to creation science in general, because it demonstrates the validity of me saying over and over again that it's a great time to be a biblical creationist. And so let's respond to a little bit more as we start to wind down a little bit.
Excited this isn't the Genesis flood and the acute ark story, because this happened further back in history and blah blah blah. Well, why would they even say that? The reason they say that is when you look at the genetics of everyone on the planet, it should be very widespread if we've been evolving for at least 6 million years from an ape-like creature. But when they examine it, it's very narrowly focused. So they said rescuing device. Okay, what happened was it did spread out over millions of years, but then a catastrophic event occurred where almost everyone died out and a small population survived to then start repopulating the earth. And that wasn't too long ago, so it hasn't widened out very far.
By the way, Jay Seeger, the speaker here, has a degree in physics and engineering. He's not at all qualified in evolutionary biology. But neither am I, of course. However, when I reference things like this paper, Perspectives on Human Variation Through the Lens of Diversity and Race, and it says, and I quote, "The diverse human populations across the globe have spent too little time apart from our common origin 50,000 years ago to have developed many individually adapted traits. Human trait and disease differences by continental ancestry are thus as much the result of non-genetic as genetic forces." Let's be clear here, modern Homo sapiens have only been around for around 150,000 years. And that is an incredibly small amount of time when referring to evolutionary timescales.
What's interesting is that's the genetics of people. Then they said, look,
All right, so what we get here is more evolutionary philosophy, evolutionary storytelling, lots of assertions, claims. He doesn't back it up, though. He reads a portion from this paper that makes a claim on evolutionary history, but doesn't actually support it by the data. Notice how I'm actually supporting everything I'm saying. I'm supporting it with the data, showing why. So if I share screen here, because he wants to say, well, 150,000 years is not really that long in the overall scheme of things, according to the evolutionary timescale. But the point is, the mutation rate in these DNA compartments is fast. It's about 0.1 to 0.5 in the mitochondrial DNA. It's about 1 to 3 in the Y chromosome. But there's very little genetic variation, so it doesn't take a long time to accumulate these differences. This is the paper where we discovered Eve. This is in the conventional literature. Dr. Rob Carter, young Earth creationist, who wrote this. This is the Eve consensus sequence. And you can go through here. It talks about the average, right? There's only about 21.6 nucleotide sites that differ from the mitochondrial sequence. You can go through this paper. I've got a couple slides. For example, here, the worldwide human mitochondrial consensus is composed of 16,569 nucleotides. Based on the current data set, 84.1% of the mitochondrial genome is invariant. It's basically the same, very low variation in mitochondrial DNA. That's why it's easy to find, for the most part, this Eve consensus sequence, which the evolutionary community wants to argue is a coalesced sequence with no reason behind it. We would argue it's a created sequence. This is Eve's sequence, and we can easily figure it out. Because so essentially what the authors did here, okay, is they took worldwide mitochondrial DNA and aligned them all. And the best illustration I can make to make it understandable is, and if you go here, there's different excerpts. Okay, like here, the world consensus sequence is unambiguous except for very few nucleotide positions. Well, how do they know that? How did they figure that out? Well, if I had a document, let's say I had a document, I gave it to 10 different people, and then I asked them to make a manual copy of this document. They all have the same document at first, right? Well, you would find, once you receive the copies back, you would find that each copy has mistakes, and the mistakes would be unique to each person copying the document, right? Because they're not copying each other, they're copying the document independently. And so you're going to find your own unique mistakes, since nobody's going to copy the document perfectly. And so all we have to do is look through the copies. We can find the mistakes, the deviants, the rare deviants, and subtract all of the typographical errors to the point where you now have the original document. And that's what they did with mitochondrial DNA, is they found the rare deviants, and they also found where there's no differences at all. And they took out all of the mutations. They do this by comparing these mitochondrial DNA sequences from people across the globe, and then they come up with the original document, the Eve consensus sequence, and that is Eve's original sequence. It's not a coalesced sequence. There's no evidence that this is a woman who goes back to prior ancestors. No, this is her sequence, and this sequence is invariable. There's not high levels of genetic diversity, and the mutation rate is fast. We can see how far people have diverged from Eve. We're not necessarily concerned with substitution rates here, okay, which is species-wide change. We're concerned with how much people today have diverged from Eve. And most people have less than 50 mutations. There are less than 50 mutations removed from Eve's sequence. And your max, again, is only about 140-ish. And I've described in the previous section of this video how you can explain the maximum, which is found in African lineages. Very easy to explain. And so with a fast mutation rate and a DNA compartment that is invariable, has low variation, there's few DNA differences, the only way to explain this is through the young Earth creation model, because this is only a couple hundred generations worth of DNA variation. That's it. And the same thing goes for the Y chromosome. And so when Dan keeps asserting and claiming, using evolutionary philosophy, that Adam and Eve, Y chromosome Adam and mitochondrial Eve, who they don't believe is the biblical Adam and Eve, goes back a couple 100,000 years, he's not demonstrating this through the data, because my challenge to him is, show us, SciManDan, how you can get a mitochondrial DNA with incredibly low variation and yet a fast mutation rate. How do you get this DNA compartment going back 200,000 years or even 100,000 years? How do you get the Y chromosome DNA compartment? How do you get the Y chromosome with low variation, a fast mutation rate? How do you push that back 200,000 years? No, you've only got a couple hundred generations in each DNA compartment. This refutes evolutionary time. Notice this: the 827 sequences within the data set contain 2,631 variant positions, and on average differed from the consensus. You have the consensus sequence, the original document, you can say. They differed by only about 21.6 nucleotides. So most of the mitochondrial DNA sequences from people around the globe was the same. It was invariant. That's what it means. And the differences were only about 21 points. That's trivial. That's nothing. That's biblical time right there. That's biblical time. And in light of the reality here, notice hypermutation. Okay. Several papers going over hypermutation. Notice this. Our findings imply, this is from the conventional literature, our findings imply that defects in DNA repair genes. So you have these incredibly complicated, these well-designed DNA repair enzymes in the genomes of living organisms, when you have all these mutations arising. Trillions of mutations in your cells, because we have roughly 100 trillion cells in our bodies, and you have mutations happening all the time. in each cell, and we would go extinct in a couple generations if we didn't have these amazingly designed DNA repair enzymes that can fix these DNA breaks. Well, if you actually have mutations, which could have been the case after the flood in light of environment and a faster mutation rate and DNA just breaking down in a dissimilar way to the pre-flood world, then what you would have is hypermutation in these lineages, which result in more DNA diversity. And if it's in a small population, then fixation rates are also faster. We have these mutations pop up and then they become stuck in place in that entire species, okay, in that entire group. And notice this from 2022, they admit that this is the case, as in this can be the case, because they say defects in DNA repair genes can increase germline mutation rates and even have an effect on the somatic mutation rates, because you have the somatic cells, right? Like your skin cells, those are not passed on. And then you got your germ cell, your egg and sperm cells, your reproductive cell lines, where these mutations are passed on. And so hypermutation is a reality, and it really just destroys a lot of these assumptions. And so the point is, SciManDan, he's not providing anything challenging. He's not backing up his model. He's being, unfortunately, it's an unproductive video. It's fun. I love responding to it. It got a lot of views, which is free advertising. I have no problem with that. Good for business when the critics, tongue in cheek, when the critics respond, because I love responding to the critics, and I will keep responding to all the critics because it's a walk in the park. And I said it 3 or 4 times, and I'll say it again. These responses from these critics, especially the popular critics, it's a gift to creation science. It really shows in 2024 how powerful, how sophisticated the biblical creation model is. The question of ancestry is best answered from a biblical creation starting point, as we can see here, because Genesis and its claims allow us to make some very specific predictions and retrodictions. And so let's move on and see what else we have from Dan here. And so as I pull it up, his last couple points there, just dismantled based on the data. Claims are not going to save the day for the evolutionists. Assertions are not going to save the day for the evolutionists. Evolutionary philosophy will not save the day for those that want to believe strawberries and whales are related through common ancestry. And that's what SciManDan believes. And so let's continue a little bit here.
Let's take a look at the genetics of animals. They came to the same conclusion. It seems like almost every animal on the planet today was almost wiped out in the past. A small group survived to repopulate about the same time that people were repopulating the planet. Well, surprise, I have a talk that's called Surprise, the Bible Explains That, and that's one of them that the Bible explains why they're seeing that, because there was a biblical flood where you had 8 people survive, 6 of which repopulated the planet. And from what I've read, it seems like you can also divide up the genetics of people across the planet into 3 major categories, which you had 3 couples coming off the ark, so maybe that accounts for that.
There we go, ladies and gentlemen. A grown man suggesting that 6 people, just 6 people, are responsible for the entire human race. The incest alone must have been positively biblical. That sentence alone, by the way, tells me he's talking nonsense. Now, according to the IUCN, to retain evolutionary potential to remain genetically flexible and diverse, the IUCN criteria suggests we would need at least 500 effective individuals. Now, that would require a population of between 2,500 and 5,000.
Amen. Amen. So many great points that everybody needs to hear. Some of the most amazing. So a couple things. This is based on the assumption that all DNA variation is a result of deleterious mutations over time. Again, the creation model suggests created heterozygosity. Adam and Eve would have been created with pre-existing DNA differences. The bottlenecks in the creation model, the creation event, the flood, and the Tower of Babel, were one generation. They were short-lived, and they were followed by rapid and exponential population growth. I really do wish and pray that SciManDan could accurately represent the biblical creation model. I've pointed out earlier how it is the evolutionary model in their Out of Africa story that actually has the inbreeding problem, because inbreeding reveals the hidden reservoir of genetic mistakes, and you would have a lot of genetic mistakes and deleterious mutations that are hidden in recessive form in the out of Africa event that would manifest outwardly in disease, in degeneration, in accelerated degeneration. And so the evolutionary community, they only invoked this post hoc ad hoc story, the out of Africa story, because when they sequenced the human genome, when they discovered that humans have very low genetic diversity, this was contradictory to evolutionary based assumptions, which is that humans go back a couple 100,000 years. And then before that, you have Homo erectus, who lived and shared the globe for about 1 million years. And before then, you have Homo habilis and the Australopithecine-like ancestors. And so these are many, many, many generations of mutations accumulating, mutations being passed on to future generations, okay, to progeny. And so mutations add something because they're adding something that was not previously there. And so they're adding genetic diversity, which means over time, mutations adding to the gene pool, there should be a lot of genes floating around these populations. And so today, humans should actually have high levels of genetic diversity, but humans actually have low levels of genetic diversity. Well, this fits perfectly with the biblical creation model that suggests God created two people, Adam and Eve. This right off the bat restricts levels of genetic diversity. What do we see today in humans? Low levels of genetic diversity. That's exactly what we'd expect. And then in animal species, we find higher levels of genetic diversity, which points us right back to the creation event in the biblical creation model of ancestry, where God doesn't create just two kinds of every animal, as in, 2 dogs, 2 cats, 2 of this, 2 of that. No, he creates animals in populations in fully working and fully functioning ecosystems. And so we should expect higher levels of genetic diversity in animals and lower levels of genetic diversity in humans. And that's exactly what we find. And yet this is exactly what we expected. But it is the evolutionary model that has to invoke post hoc, ad hoc rationalization. When they invoke these stories that are post hoc, like the out of Africa population bottleneck, it actually results in more problems, like the inbreeding problem that I've been describing here. And so the genetic data points us to the out of Babel dispersal event. It points us to the flood bottleneck, and it also points us right back to the special creation of Adam and Eve. And SciManDan has yet to engage any of this data in any kind of sophisticated and meaningful way. And I would really love to see him actually engage and challenge this data and the evidence that strongly, that powerfully contradicts his evolutionary based model. And okay, let's see. I think we only have a couple minutes left. And so let me share screen again. I'll mute myself and we'll see what else he has to say. Guys, this is fun. This is a walk in the park and I love it. We got to answer the critics. It's basically a job requirement of any of us who are involved in any kind of apologetics. We have to engage the critics. It's important. We have to show our brothers and sisters in the Lord that their very best arguments against young earth creation fail and fail miserably. Evidence for biblical creation. Jay, actually one of my favorite topics, so I'm really glad that you brought that up. It's such powerful evidence for our position, and no surprise to the biblical creationists. I mean, the Bible says God created two people, Adam and Eve. Right off the bat, that restricts what? Genetic diversity. Today, humans have low genetic diversity. As you pointed out, every single human being, we're about 99.999% the same. There should be a much higher levels of genetic diversity if, again, as you pointed out, we've been evolving for millions of years, from the Australopithecines to habilis to erectus to Homo sapiens. And what do? A rescue device, a hypothetical out of Africa population bottleneck, some near extinction event that we have no evidence for at all, really.
Really? You claim there's no evidence for that, but then claim that 6 people hopped off the ark at the end and were responsible for 7 billion people? Amazing.
And one of my favorite studies that you just pointed to, Jay, that says over 90% of all species have arisen at the same time because of, again, low levels of genetic diversity. So some of the best evidence for a literal Adam and Eve is where? In our genetics. We've literally discovered the first couple.
Wow, just wow. They really, really, really believe it, don't they? What do you guys think? You think that just 6 people populated the Earth? Let me know in the comments below. But for now, we're all done and dusted for another Tinfoil Tuesday. Thanks so much for watching. It truly is appreciated. Look, we are now less...
Well, we made our way through the entire incredibly challenging video by SciManDan. Again, I love when he puts out videos. I hope he puts out more. Congratulations to the 100,000 plus views on this video, SciManDan. I do appreciate it. And I'd love to have a discussion or a debate with SciManDan on this topic in the future. Doesn't even necessarily have to be on my channel. Could just be a back and forth discussion on the evidence for Adam and Eve, because I saw a lot of rhetoric there at the end. The genetic data, yes, it does tell us that we originated from just 3 reproducing couples. Low levels of genetic variation, even the allele frequencies that we see globally, suggest we all came from just 3 reproducing couples. I mean, we have Y chromosomes that are Y chromosome specific, geographically specific. We have Chinese Y chromosomes, African Y chromosomes, European Y chromosomes. And the reason why we have geographically specific Y chromosomes is because at the Tower of Babel, people are confused, languages are confused, and then they spread out to different parts of the globe and they become isolated. They accumulate their own independent and unique mutations. And so each group worldwide, they start drifting apart from each other genetically, and yet remain homogeneous as a species, as the human species. I mean, this screams biblical creation. This screams the Tower of Babel. Allele frequencies are the same thing. Allele frequencies worldwide match up with a dispersal event just thousands of years ago from the Tower of Babel, somewhere in the Middle East. There should be not only geographically Y chromosome diversity, geographically specific Y chromosomes. If evolution is true, there should be people groups that are highly divergent than other people groups because of those mutations accumulating in independent lineages for tens of thousands of years. That's what we should find, but we don't. And so the 3 reproducing couples here, notice this is work by Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson. And you'll notice on this phylogenetic tree, it is an unrooted tree, but unrooted trees give the most natural reading of the data because it doesn't require any assumptions of where we are going to put the root. Because evolutionists will root these trees based on evolutionary assumptions. They'll root it somewhere in Africa, since they believe African populations are older, since there's more diversity. We've already engaged that. So notice this on this tree. All mitochondrial DNA goes back to 3 major haplogroups. This is interesting. Okay. Well, what are the implications here? We have L, M, and N. They are separated by just short lines. Notice the lines separating L, M, and N. The lines represent DNA differences or mutations. They're short. But the lines spreading out from these 3 major haplogroups are long, which suggests a lot of DNA differences in more time, more mutations over time. This is basically random mutations in populations over time or over generations. So this right here, L, M, and N, the lines separating them, they may actually represent pre-flood history where fewer mutations would accumulate. And so on a phylogenetic tree like this, specifically mitochondrial DNA, the lines would be shorter. But since we've had more mutations accumulate after the flood, post-flood history being the lines radiating out from these 3 major haplogroups, we would expect more DNA differences, more generations, more reflection of that at least, and so more mutations. The Bible says that from 8 people, all of the earth was repopulated. And from these three reproducing couples, Shem, Ham, Japheth, and their three wives, was the earth overspread, was repopulated. And yet we see on this mitochondrial DNA, which I believe is fascinating. Okay. And there's other haplogroups, like right here, could be a post-Babel dispersal event. Okay. And Dr. Nathaniel Jensen, he's made testable and falsifiable predictions based off of this, and specifically the Y chromosome. Maybe we can read the history of civilization off of these trees if the lines radiating out from the center points here really are post-flood history. Okay. But I just find it interesting, and I didn't see SciManDan engage any of these points, as Jay Seeger did bring up this specific point, that this evidence here, this data may simply represent Noah's three daughters-in-law and how they would be the mothers of all of these different lineages in many ways. And so I think we're going to wrap it up there, guys. This was a fun video. This was another Answering the Critics video. The previous one was Guts of Gibbon. So please do check out that one as well. You know, we like to be comprehensive. You know, we like to be thorough. And so stay tuned, as I will be deciding who the next lucky critic is that I get to respond to. God bless all.